Good morning, everybody. Great to see many of you back here for this, feels earlier start because it's the weekend after all. So we're going to continue right away, and I'm going to step aside first thing because the four sessions that we have are going to be chaired by grad students and postdoc from the Institute who will, as of now, take over from me.
All right, hello, good morning. I'm Corinna. I'm a graduate student here in the Joukowsky Institute, and I was a member of the organizing committee for this conference. And I'll be running this morning's first session under the theme Perspectives. And before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to remind you that about our format. We'll take questions at the end of the session, not at the end of each paper. So if you just want to hold on to your questions, and we will take them at the end. And yes, our first speaker is Eva Mol. Eva earned her PhD at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Before moving to the United Kingdom to work at the University College London, she completed postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Chicago in the Classics Department, and here at the Joukowsky Institute, Brown University. She's now at the University of York as an assistant professor in Roman archaeology. In addition, she's a senior editor at the Cambridge University journal, Archaeological Dialogues. She's published articles on digital archaeology, theory, and archaeology, ethics, and has a forthcoming book through Oxford University Press on style and assemblages in Roman archaeology. She's currently working on a new monograph about mythology and Mediterranean archaeology. Eva will be presenting today on new agendas in decolonized Mediterranean archaeologies. Please, yeah.
Is this working? Am I clear? Okay, cool. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be back. And for having me, and when I say me, I mean us here, because I'm representing a collective. So the other faces here. From January to June 2021, we've organized a seminar series for the Institute of Classical Studies in London. I will abbreviate this to ICS, called Disorienting the Classical. And it had a very similar goal as today, to see where we stand in the intersections of different fields, studying antiquity. So this series were born out of a discussion on dropping the classical from the archaeological seminar series name, which we did, and what we could gain from this. And another motivation, as was also mentioned yesterday, was the encouraging rupture, I think, in the field that we had regarding decolonization and Black Lives Matters, and much longer ongoing debates about complicity of the classical in historical construction of elitist and misogynist and racist attitudes. So the team, and I will try to channel them. So if I sound very angry, I'll be playing Corinna. If I sound and if I'm more reflective, I'm one of the others. I think the team was quite equipped to have this discussion. So Corinna Riva does Mediterranean archaeology of the first millennium BC. It's Andrew Gardner does Roman archaeology in Britain, so representing more of the northern margins. Lindsey who's a classicist but works on Persian pre-Islamic Iran. Myself, sort of standing within classics, art history, and archaeology, and also part of her team and the discussions, director of the Institute, Catherine Harlow, who's a classicist, working in the field of classical reception, so by default more better in reflecting on things than we were, perhaps. So we've learned an incredible deal from each other and the seminars, and I wanted to take this as an opportunity to share this, also because I want to perhaps create sort of a playing field today, and trying to take the discussion that's been going on for the past 5 years as a starting point for today. And I was asked by the organizer to reflect on the 4 session topics through the seminar, because it took us 6 months, so we've discussed a lot, which I cannot summarize in 20 minutes. But first, something about the title slide, perhaps, New Agendas in Decolonized Mediterranean Archaeologists. So Kim Tolbear and many others have been quite firm about what the priorities should be of the decolonization movement, which is about the acknowledgement and disruption of ongoing colonial injustice and repatriation. And we should be mindful of this, I think, since you cannot repatriate a syllabus, the term decolonization should not be used lightly. And also not in a too hermeneutic way, I think. So decolonization, in a very essence, at least implies action, so not reflection, and that's what I want to use it for today. Second, I think I should explain the broken record image on the slide. It's an object or symbol that cuts through much of what I will say this morning. So when we decided on this as a topic at the end of the pandemic in the summer of 21, decolonization was a very hot topic, and this made me personally very hesitant to embark on this series, because I didn't want to rehash things that were already said by other people, said by many panels, especially concerning this topic. I think we need to listen to each other and not reinvent the wheel every time. So the analogy became quite explicit when I had a conversation with one of my colleagues, who's a person of color working in classics, and answered when I asked him whether he wanted to participate. He said, Eva, I would love to, but no. The past year I've been asked to perform on 15 panels on this topic. I feel like a broken record, and I get this increasing feeling that nothing will change anyway. So this was super cynical as a response, but of course he had a point. And the fact that my colleague was feeling like a broken record, I think, points very directly to the largest issue. He was asked over and over again because the rest of the field is too wide, so he was performing that role every time. So we keep coming back to these issues, like that broken record. And I feel in this respect that we as academics are also absolutely terrible when it comes to action. We know the systemic issue, and we respond with, let's organize a conference. So with this attitude, I think we can fill conferences, sessions for the next decade or more, but of course that won't really help us change anything quickly. So has the time of raising awareness and pointing out issues not already passed? Let's go to the 4 points and the perspectives. How to have this discussion again and not sound like a broken record was the main issue, as I said, and we want to think through matters constructively. And for this reason, we structured the series around the philosophical concept of orientation taken from Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology. So that allowed us to rethink the classical and the Mediterranean and archaeology and classics through the concepts of orientation and familiarity and otherness. So that's not only about orientation as how we find our way, but also how we come to feel at home somewhere, or how we're not able to. So the familiar in this sense is an effect of inhabitants, how some people, even in a strange or unfamiliar environment, will find their way. And for some people, this field fits better than for others, in social forms or in physical form. And turning this to classics, the series focus was on how we've become familiarized and oriented to topics, and how this made the field a much narrower working space than we often realize. And it also means focusing on how we can reorient to include otherness. And in this way, we wanted to try to make people perhaps feel at home in a different classical Mediterranean working field. So for this reason, and this is the, as you can see, it was a very, very long seminar. And if I look back at it, I feel exhausted. We split the seminar in 3 parts. So we had orientation, where we reflected on definitions and stuff, and disorienting, where we tried to expose and disrupt the so-called habitus surrounding the field, focusing on decolonization. And then we had reorienting, the final part. And especially this part, where we tried to be more constructive, gave me lots of hope and inspiration for the future. So, is it still necessary? I can answer that question. We can talk about this in rooms and be very agreeable, but as soon as you put things on Facebook, you get pushback about stuff. So of course it's still relevant and necessary to reflect on things, and that raising awareness has not passed already. But I want to take this to Mediterranean archaeology, and much has been said already yesterday, but I think Mediterranean archaeology took an interesting position within our series by its fragmentation and how it emerged. So for the state of the field, I think you and me as well, we set ourselves quite a challenge. We might wonder if there is a field. If we look at the foundation of Mediterranean archaeology, in many ways it's, I think, based on anti-classical movements, so defined on what it's not, rather than what it is. So by default, that makes things, of course, very fragmented, and I think it became only more positively defined during the 1990s when landscape archaeology took off, post-colonial perspective, and survey became a more integrated intellectual tool, in the sense that it was not just about finding new sites, but charting long-term change, including modern histories, colonial patterns, connectivity, non-elite, and the relation between native and colonizing communities. So post-colonialism became intimately linked to the Mediterranean and archaeology, and I think that was great. And I am myself, I did my MA in Leiden. It was a MA or research master in Mediterranean archaeology, and for me it was very natural that we covered all these topics. So Fatimid Egypt, and I did Neolization of Syria, and I did my master's on Crusader archaeology. And that was very normal thing. But if I explain this to people in classics, they always feel very weirded out that I did my dissertation on such a wild, marginal topic. So, and I also think that idea of that we can do all these things within Mediterranean archaeology and curricula is decreasing a bit. But I think the pedagogy part of this seminar will talk more about that. But I think they offered a very powerful counter-narrative to the classical canon then. But what also happened is that step that was taken away from the classical made Mediterranean archaeology a bit too complacent, as if the creation of this sub-branch meant cutting from all the existing problems. So what happened, I think in the past, 5 to 10 years, classics saw itself more directly confronted with its colonial and racist, elitist roots, and so did anthropology, longer than 10 years. And I think Mediterranean archaeology did not really feel any direct need for that reflection, apart from the still present colonial issues of archaeological projects, which was, of course, discussed yesterday. So for the past 25 years, Mediterranean archaeology rested on their laurels without self-reflection. And I think we distance ourselves from this discussion, whereas we're, of course, still much attached to standing issues of intellectual colonialism. For instance, in many ways, for instance, in the absurd way, we think that archaeological theory is a measure of quality scholarship, for instance, elitism and whiteness, of course, and a new danger that we're letting slide at this very moment with this digital colonialism. So the post-colonial critique that succeeded to highlight this diversity of the ancient past did not make the discipline a more diverse place. So for this, we need institutional disorientation. So in our first part of the series, it became clear how much of this post-colonial archaeology actually remains closely linked to research to Greece and Italy, and the Greek and the Roman past mainly. And the UK and Northern Europe and the US dominate this debate because this is where the money is and this is where the power is. So journals and funding and foreign schools and institutions that will gatekeep who will work where is both keeping this scholarship this way, Eurocentric and pretty conservative perhaps also. So that very briefly about perspectives, then to pedagogy. The conversation we had many people talking about the topic, and I especially liked the panel that we had with someone from Howard University that dissolved their classics program. And that was a very enlightening thing because we all think, oh no, they're dissolving classics. And when they talked about it in the end, I think they took a step forward maybe rather than backward by no longer regarding classics as this weird emancipatory field. And a few other things we learned is that pedagogy might be the easiest way to change narrative within a few generations. And we see that very well happening at the moment. Current generation of professors increasingly think actively about diverse reading lists and subjects and reflect very excitingly to broader issues. Another thing is that we learned it's very important to listen to students. And you see a few things in the upper. You see the London Classes of Colour, which we invited. It's an amazing group of students and graduates that do work they should not be doing to diversify their own curriculum. So they invite speakers and they write letters. And I also invited the Brown Decolonization group, who had a very cool and very inspiring student initiative here on campus during COVID about classical sculpture on the campus and colonial legacies. It was very empowering stuff and it was really exciting. And none of my colleagues but one showed up for this. So yeah, that was thing to reflect on, I think. And the last thing we learned is how students in the US still receive quite an unrealistic neo-colonial image of the Mediterranean, which happens mostly pre-university, in which places like Italy and Greece become these magical centers, cut loose from their contemporary realities and travel to that. And studying classics in the first place very often is tied to this sort of sacred pilgrimage to roots of civilization. And then coming back to Ahmed, people become familiarized with something that does not reflect reality. In the UK, I notice how students arrive at university with Egypt as this oriental wunderkammer filled with mummies, that idea. So in the first example, people feel familiar where they should not. And the second, they thought strangeness where they should not. And that's, I think, what we need to actively respond to in every class we teach, of course. So the answer to all these 3 points, Howard's decision or student initiative and the issue of over-familiarization, is the same. Maybe we should actively marginalize parts of classics, disorient, something which is, I think, quite manageable in pedagogical strategies. Much more difficult on a political level. So in terms of how this reflects on the discipline, the orientation sessions we learned, I think, something quite powerful, which is that the lines of disciplines are a form of inheritance, and not just anybody can receive or turn this into a possession. And Ahmed notes that in her work on being included, is that through these very decisions of what counts as within the discipline, such lines mark out the edges of disciplinary homes, which also mark out those who are out of line. And it's harder for these people to get tenure homes or funding. And it's here where perhaps the most important thing is that we took away from a series that, since we reflected on this every session, we learned that nobody who participated felt at home in their discipline. So if anything, I think this is a best point of departure for any new direction in Mediterranean archaeology. We had very personal reflections on this, and there was a very strong common sense that they all felt they worked outside the line, marginalized positions through background or subject or other things, which made their journey harder. But those who made it had great work, very reflexive and more critical. So it's not bad to be the outsider, is what I also wanted to note. And we discussed geographies a lot as well. I'll be brief on this, but coming back to the issue that their focal points in Mediterranean archaeology are Greece, Rome, and Egypt. And what I think is most important, that we should be very mindful of how we do this inclusive Mediterranean archaeology on these very terms. So this emerged, for instance, during a discussion that we had at the year of decolonization we had with Zina Kamash, which was mentioned yesterday. It's not just about adding different geographies to the same narrative. We need to use the gaps to create new narratives, and these narratives are situated as much in the center of Rome as they are in the Black Sea, West Asia, North Africa. So this is also what I'm really looking forward to Leah and Lara's talks today on the Black Sea and the Adriatic, which is not just research located on the so-called margins geographically, but tap into different underexplored interests and viewpoints, which significantly add to a more inclusive perception of the field. So new orientations emerge naturally if we break down the canon and build up from the margins. So the last point on diversity leads, I think, closely to our third part of a series of reorientation. So in this part, we let go of explicit matters of reflection, and we didn't use the word decolonization anymore, and we invited people who work in radically different ways with classics and archaeology to show how we can constructively add to the fields. And this was, as I said, it was such an inspiring, exciting part. And it gave us so much energy, and something that, if we want to remain relevant, which was one of the questions for the conference today, something that we should invest in. We had Cora Gilroy Ware working on pop ephemera and record sleeve by Black American musicians in the 20th century, and she was able, through this research, to really change the whole concept of neoclassicism, and I loved it. We had Khoda Rezekani, who changed perspective on how we look at the Orient. So what I think was important is that these works were actively decolonizing without mentioning it, but it happened. And now that we realized that we created this narrowing working space than necessary, we have this awareness. We can break it open. We can look for new interdisciplinary approaches. And I feel we're in a great space with a lot of exciting things to do. So reflecting on this, I'll turn the broken record once again to play this tune of action-based efforts. So we can think of diversity in this case as praxis, drawing on this Marxist understanding of what intellectual labor is. So I think that might be an easy answer. If we see that people do not feel at home in their disciplinary homes, they actively create counter-narratives in very exciting ways, the discussion on who we are is not relevant. It's a matter of politics of disorienting, to create institutional space for difference. And if we think with and through orientation, I think we should allow these different moments of disorientation together, almost as if they are sitting as bodies around a different table. And around that table, from a disciplinary perspective, as Mediterranean archaeologists, we can be louder in the current debate. And I think we should be more vocal. So last year, someone showed me a funding proposal from a classics department on that was funded on revolutionizing the Roman past by, it was said, for the first time looking at non-elite societies. So yeah, reflect on this. Further, what sets Mediterranean archaeology apart from core classics, and this has been mentioned yesterday, I think very well, very brilliantly. We're collaborating with colleagues, and more importantly, non-academic collaborators from the Mediterranean. We add important diversification by working with colleagues from Turkey and Syria and Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria and Romania and Croatia. We are confronted not with an abstract ancient third space that is occupied by ancient Greek and Latin inhabitants, but with modern histories and current politics and people speaking Spanish, Italian, French, Albanian, Turkish, Hebrew, Berber, etc. We can think from this experience of strangeness, becoming a stranger in different ways than classics and US anthropology does. And I think a means of disorienting in this way that creates important empathy. I'll conclude agendas, having brought up, and I'm sorry for that, quite a diverse mishmash of issues, but is a very complex intersectional problem, so that's not my fault. Nonetheless, I firmly believe we can get some priorities straight, perhaps. The positive message here, I think, is that challenging traditional narratives and approaches are happening, and in very exciting ways. The less positive message is that we do not allow enough space for this multivocality. So as a conclusion, I have 3 points based on our ICS discussions. We have established that the field is not diverse enough and in need of more equity, and in terms of both reflection and action, we should perhaps be calling for politics that involves disorientation. This means changing the relationship between knowledge and transformation. So rather than suggesting that knowledge leads or should lead to transformation, transformation as something practical leads to knowledge. So maybe now or soon, we can stop charting inequality in journals and amongst faculty. This is our starting point. We know this by now. We can start phasing out the explicit use of decolonization in course titles and workshop, but move to constructive approaches and practices. So if orientation is a matter of how we reside or how we clear space that is familiar, then orientations take time and require giving up time. And this is where the responsibilities of those in power are. And we are all in power in some sense, whether this is fixing a reading list or being a member of faculty anywhere or head of department. Diversification of editorial boards and funding, obviously, broken record, but also actively look for different scholars in terms of both topics and authors, inviting our colleagues from Libya, Morocco, and Egypt and Slovenia to publish, not wait for submissions, accept that it's different and not lesser scholarships, secure funding for English language writing, publishing in Mediterranean journals. And I think we are moving backwards in this. I don't know if any one of you experienced this, but I published an article last month in Cambridge Archaeological Journal, and I was asked to translate original book and article titles in my bibliography that were in Spanish, Italian, and French to English. And I've never experienced this before. And I saw on Facebook a search for a standing committee member of the TREC, so the Theoretical Roman Archaeology Conference, with a call for applications. And please search actively for someone instead of relying on this social familiarity where I talked about. So it needs our effort and time actively. So yes, Mediterranean archaeology perhaps needs this constructive second wave, third wave, whatever we call it. But there's a lot of potential to take this step and add to a debate in very cool, constructive ways. And clearly, even as a non-field, we have a lot to offer. So the hard part, I think, is action. And what makes a lesson hard is what makes a lesson worth repeating, maybe even if it is a broken record. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was great. So our next speaker is Benjamin Luley. Benjamin Luley is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and is currently the chair of the Department of Classics at Gettysburg College. He completed his BA in Anthropology and History with honors at Penn State University and his MA and PhD in Anthropology at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the impact of the Roman Empire on the colonized people of the Western Mediterranean, particularly the region of Mediterranean Gaul. More generally, he is interested in the archaeology of colonialism and rethinking paradigms of inequality and equality for understanding the diversity of human social organization across time and space. Luley has excavated in France, Italy, Tunisia, and the United States, and has been working at the archaeological site of Latara in modern-day Lot in France since 2006, and since 2017, he has more specifically been helping to lead the excavations at the Roman-era port in the settlement of Latara. In 2020, he has published a single-authored book on his research at Lot with Oxbow Books, entitled Continuity and Rupture, an Archaeology of Colonial Transformations at Ancient Latara. And he will talk to us today about comparing colonialism between classics and anthropology in Roman Mediterranean Gaul. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to Peter and Tyler and Amy and everybody that put this together. It's really great to be here, so thank you. And I'm going to be sort of focusing on a more specific topic, but hopefully in ways that build off what Ava just talked about and building off some of the themes. And specifically looking, as Joseph alluded to, and with the title, this issue of how we compare, how we orient ourselves in terms of wider debates about where we are in the field in terms of Mediterranean archaeology and how we relate to sort of larger questions. And in particular, sort of shifting perhaps more sort of a European sort of based understanding of archaeology. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is drawing upon, say, perspectives that have emerged for me working in the United States and this odd divide we sort of have in the United States in a very specific origin of archaeology in the United States, in which we have both anthropology and classics offering, in some sense, archaeology. So building off of that and hopefully sort of thinking about it in new ways and hopefully trying to think about breaking down some of those barriers. So as with other empires in world history, the Roman Empire expanded its rule largely through violent conquest, which is often met by considerable local resistance and revolt. Looking across time and space, despite the vast differences in human social behavior, it seems rather clear that people do not willingly surrender their local autonomy and sovereignty and that the imposition by force of foreign rule often has far-reaching consequences, generally of a traumatic nature for colonized peoples. The need to understand these consequences for local peoples across space and time becomes particularly critical when one considers that over the course of human history, increasingly large percentages of the world's population have come under some form of imperial rule, culminating, of course, with modern European colonization across the globe in the 19th and 20th centuries. With its rich material history spanning well over 400 years of rule in conquered provinces, the Roman Empire then should arguably play an integral role in thinking comparatively about the impact of empire on local peoples across history. Nonetheless, I would argue that due to unfortunate disciplinary divides, anthropologists have only rarely analyzed the Roman Empire in comparison with the more familiar peoples and time periods of anthropological research. And conversely, classical scholars have not always shown a deep interest in thinking about the Roman Empire in terms of broader comparisons with other empires across human history, particularly those of recent times. These disciplinary boundaries and divides are evident even in the words we choose to describe and analyze the Roman Empire. Classical scholars have often hesitated, at times at least, or resisted altogether, applying the term colonialism to the Roman Empire, despite certain important structural similarities, along with many differences, of course, between the Roman Empire and other imperial powers, such as the violent conquest of indigenous populations, taxation and exploitation, and varying degrees of settler colonization. At the same time, within the discipline of anthropology, the archaeology of colonialism as a subject of research, as well as an engagement with decolonization theories and methodologies, have become increasingly popular in the past 2 decades. For this talk, I want to identify in particular 2 issues relating to the Roman Empire that could arguably benefit from a deeper comparative analysis with the notions of colonialism more broadly. And then by extension, just thinking about how this can hopefully help to start break down some of these disciplinary divides. The first concerns structures of power and thinking beyond questions of identity. Since the debates around so-called Romanization first began in the 1900s, scholars have long been interested in how provincial peoples identified themselves, and certainly recent scholarship has brought out the complexities of identity in local settings. However, with an emphasis on identity, arguably less attention has been drawn to the question of structural imbalances in power implicit in Roman rule and the impact of these power imbalances on local societies. Secondly, less emphasis has often been placed on analyzing local provincial societies diachronically, with an equal analysis of both pre- and post-conquest societies. Instead, I would argue that the disciplinary boundaries of classical studies, focusing as it does on the Roman world specifically, with little emphasis on the earlier Iron Age, or if at best it's just simply a sort of pre-period before the main period of research, has led to scholars often treating the Roman occupation of the Western provinces as a rather ahistorical and largely bloodless fait accompli, rather than an ongoing process of control, structured by implicit and sometimes explicit violence. In this talk, then, I want to suggest that analyzing Roman rule in the conquered provinces as an example of colonialism allows us to better evaluate diachronically the changing power relationships implicit in the establishment of Roman rule and how these processes impacted indigenous lifeways in the provinces. In turn, this also allows Mediterranean archaeologists to contribute to a wider understanding of the structural similarities and differences of empires across human history. Looking specifically at the example of the ongoing excavations at the site of Latara in what was Roman Mediterranean Gaul, toward the end of the talk, I then want to ask what a decolonized archaeology of the Roman provinces at a specific site might focus on. First, it is worth thinking about definitions. As already alluded to, if empires share one thing in common, it is seemingly the inherent violence by which rule over foreign peoples is established and maintained. Furthermore, the strategies by which empires then consolidate their rule over far-flung territories generally share to varying degrees certain common aspects, involving things like land seizure and the reorganization of local land ownership, the extraction of local wealth, imposing taxes and other forced levies, displacing some local peoples, especially those who revolt, and settling foreign colonists in select areas. Here then, I want to draw upon recent archaeological definitions of colonialism in a broad comparative sense and define the term as the processes, interactions, and cultural transformations associated with the violent occupation by a foreign state of territories removed from their own, involving unequal and generally exploitative relationships between these foreign peoples and the indigenous population. With this in mind, I want to briefly turn to the example of Roman-occupied Mediterranean Gaul, an example to which I will also return later to illustrate this. During the Iron Age, beginning approximately around 750 BC and continuing up to the time of the Roman conquest, the local peoples of Mediterranean Gaul many of whom spoke a Celtic language, were living in densely settled fortified sites and trading extensively with Etruscan, Greek, and Italian merchants who were importing large quantities of wine, in the amphora that we can see, into the region. Between 125 and 123 BC, the Roman armies conquered the Silurian peoples around the Greek colony of Massalia, and archaeological evidence shows destruction layers at numerous indigenous settlements in the area, either associated with this initial conquest and or with later revolts. While textual evidence is often generally lacking, the historian Diodorus Siculus records that when the Roman army seized the so-called city of the Gauls, which archaeologists have associated, generally speaking, with the settlement at Entremont, the surviving inhabitants of the settlement were sold into slavery, with the exception of 900 individuals who had been loyal to Rome and were thus spared. At the same time, in a series of battles between 125 and 121 BC, Roman armies defeated the Allobroges and the Arverni farther to the north, seemingly focusing on controlling the region immediately around Massalia and the Rhone corridor, while largely ignoring the peoples immediately to the west of the Rhone River in what is today eastern Languedoc. In 118 BC, the Roman Senate established a civilian colony in western Mediterranean Gaul, just downriver from the Gallic settlement in Naro, naming the colony Narbo Martius. Several colonies for military veterans were then also later established toward the end of the 1st century BC. After this initial conquest, the conquered territory was eventually organized as the province of Gallia Transalpina to be ruled on behalf of the Senate by a Roman official who generally held the rank of propraetor. Local peoples revolted numerous times against Roman rule, including in 100 BC among the Volcae Tectosages, in 90 BC among the Siluvii, around 74 BC among the Volcae and the Mocontii, and in 66 and 62 BC among the Allobroges farther to the north. While textual evidence for this period is not particularly abundant, some evidence about the oppressive nature of Roman rule can be seen, in particular in the text Pro Fonteo, given by Cicero in 69 BC, in defense of a former propraetor, Marcus Fonteius, against charges brought against him by local Gauls. Writing in reference to Marcus Fonteius' time as governor of Gallia Transalpina during the revolt around 74 BC, Cicero states, Marcus Fonteius, as I said, ruled over this province, which is composed of a variety of peoples. Those who were enemies he subjugated, those who had in recent times been enemies and had been punished he forced to leave their lands. Then in order that the remaining peoples, who had been frequently conquered in great wars, might be forevermore obedient to the Roman people, he demanded from them large quantities of cavalry for the wars that were then being waged by the Roman people all throughout the world, as well as large quantities of money for the purposes of financing these wars, and the greatest amount of grain possible for the war that was about to be waged in Spain. In this short discussion of the first 50 years or so of Roman rule in Mediterranean Gaul, then, we can hopefully see the broad applicability of the definition of colonialism I gave earlier. That said, of course, it is also worth pointing out that the Roman Empire differed in many ways from other instances of colonial rule. Roman rule in Mediterranean Gaul, for example, was far more reliant on local Gallic leaders to participate in the ruling of the province than, for example, British India in the 19th and 20th centuries, where an extensive imperial civil service drawing upon an educated class of British aristocrats and the bourgeoisie from the metropole ruled over the colony. Of course, it is also worth pointing out that examples of colonialism in the past 500 years have also varied extensively in terms of specific details, from the Spanish colonization of the Americas in the 1500s to the English occupation of Ireland in the 1600s through the 20th century, to French colonialism in North Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. While acknowledging both potential similarities and differences, thinking about the Roman Empire as an example of colonialism has the advantage of drawing attention to the structural imbalances and exploitative nature of Roman rule. Indeed, in all the modern cases I mentioned, one example that is quite evident in the writings of indigenous colonized peoples, as well as in the writings of some colonizers, is the disruptive and overwhelmingly negative impact colonialism has had on local peoples. What is often lacking, I suggest, is precisely this sense in much of traditional classical scholarship that Roman rule may have been largely negative for the majority of local populations. Furthermore, I would also argue that structurally, the very fact that classics as a discipline was built around an investigation and appreciation of Greek and Roman societies to the exclusion of the diversity of peoples in the ancient Mediterranean hinders this as well. This then leads to the question of decolonization. In a recent discussion of the term, indigenous archaeologist Margaret Bruchak, for example, writes that decolonizing archaeologists seek to untangle colonial influences by encouraging greater collaboration with indigenous peoples, reconsidering foundational knowledges, and paying closer attention to the ethics of handling other people's heritage. An immediate difference for the archaeology of the Roman Empire compared with more modern instances of colonialism is, of course, the obvious lack of a modern indigenous community in a place like Latara. What is more evident then, or what is more relevant then to the archaeology of the Roman Empire is the need to disentangle archaeological practice from modern colonial influences. And here this could mean distancing ourselves from the discipline of classics itself, while also reconsidering the fundamental ways we think about the Roman Empire and its impact on local peoples. Here then, I want to return to the example of Roman Mediterranean Gaul and look specifically at the ancient settlement of Latara to think about what a decolonized archaeology might look like. The archaeological site is located in the modern French commune of Lot, to the south of Montpellier. In ancient times, the settlement of Latara would have been located directly next to a lagoon emptying out into the Mediterranean at a strategic point between the mouths of the Lez River. The settlement was first founded shortly before 500 BC and was then populated by local Celtic-speaking peoples throughout its occupation. The site was continuously occupied for some 7 centuries or so until its gradual abandonment around AD 200. As I alluded to before, decolonizing Roman archaeology at a specific site in part arguably means decentering archaeology away from a purely Roman focus with an emphasis on public monuments, wealthy villi, elite life, and so on, to instead look at the subaltern lives of non-Roman peoples both before and after the Roman conquest. Glimpses of these non-Roman peoples can be immediately seen at the one colonial period necropolis, identified and excavated at Latara, where 25 tombstones with inscriptions have been found. Of the 29 deceased individuals named on these tombstones, only 13, which you can see on the right, appear to have been Roman citizens or the wives of Roman citizens, evident by the presence of the tria nomina, as we can see here for these 2 tombstones. The majority of people buried at the necropolis with inscriptions lack the tria nomina, as we can see on the left, denoting Roman citizenship, and 5 of the deceased had clearly Celtic names, which we can see in green on the top left. This is obvious, for example, for the tombstone here, which bears the inscription Elanawai Adgoneti F. Pia, translated as to Elanawa of Adgonetus, her devoted daughter. The tomb contains several goods, including a small glass urn and 3 sigillata cups. The stamp on one of the sigillata cups dates to sometime between 40 and 80 AD, meaning that Elanawa likely lived over 6 generations after the initial conquest. In this light, it's interesting to see the contrasting elements of both continuity and social change that would have likely characterized her life, such as the continuation and use of local Celtic names, with these names being recorded in the Latin language. In her case, she and her family appear to have been moderately well off, though certainly not particularly rich, and it is important to note that many others in the necropolis were apparently buried without a tombstone at all. Turning to current excavations of the settlement, since 2017, I've been working with my colleague Gael Piques to excavate the port area of the settlement adjacent to the ancient lagoon. This area of the settlement developed sometime around 200 BC as parts of the lagoon became dry land and was then occupied up to the 3rd century AD. In addition to a very large navigation canal dug to serve the port, the excavations have revealed a network of buildings all along the waterfront. Here we can see a series of buildings constructed around 25 BC. The architecture for these buildings shows some continuities with early architecture at the site, employing dry stone foundations and mud brick walls. But the stones used, particularly in the lower left corner, which represents the bottom course, are now often much larger and better quarried, suggesting an overall increase in the specialization of labor. At the level of individual rooms, many do not necessarily look quite different from rooms 200 years earlier at the site. This is true, for example, for this small room, which we can see here. The features on the dirt floor of the room show signs that people may have lived in here, including a small hearth, pits likely for holding storage jars, and near the entrance to the room, a possible small votive structure with a concentration of shells at its base. Nonetheless, at a larger level, the overall organization of the buildings from the late 1st century BC and onwards is strikingly different from that prior to the Roman conquest, when the settlement, as we can see here, in this reconstruction of the settlement around 200 BC, consisted of a dense and relatively regular arrangement of domestic rooms into long rows separated by narrow streets. For the period from circa 25 BC to AD 100, what we see instead, in contrast to the image I just showed, at the port is a looser collection of rooms, seemingly devoted to artisan activities, interspersed with rooms that may have been at least partially used for living, cooking, and perhaps sleeping. This mixed use of space has also been noted elsewhere at the site, as we can see here from excavations to the north of the main settlement. Overall, there's no coherent image of a clear-cut house from this specific area of the port, and one has the impression that lower-class workers were simply living interspersed amongst their workshops. By contrast, nearby excavations have revealed a courtyard house, the outline of which we can see here in blue, which was also built around 25 BC. While unfortunately not particularly well preserved, elements such as the remains of a mosaic floor, which we can see here, suggest that the occupants of this house were far better off than those working and living nearby. In all this, we see not so much a clear adoption of any kind of Roman culture, but rather significant social transformations in terms of class and hierarchy at the settlement, as a select few lived in more private, isolated houses, and the majority of the population became centered on artisanal quarters devoted to the production of goods. This reorganization of the social landscape in the community by the 1st century AD contrasts, as I said, significantly with the much more egalitarian and consciously structured social landscape that we can see here of the settlement prior to the Roman conquest. Interestingly, this new hierarchy in the size and quality of houses under Roman rule is something that is seen in many other colonial societies, evident here, for example, in the differences between traditional Yoruba houses in Nigeria and colonial houses appearing in the 19th and 20th centuries under British rule. These changes in houses in colonial society often appear to be linked to the emergence of socioeconomic classes, with wealthy individuals often seeking to set themselves apart in colonial society by investing wealth in large and ornate houses. Turning again to the collection of rooms from the port I showed before, the activities performed here again show some similarities with earlier centuries, including the continued use of traditional cooking pots and the continuation of local domestic rituals, such as the ritual placement of offerings buried in the floors of the rooms. However, a notable difference with pre-conquest lifeways is the relatively large number of small bronze coins found in the occupation layers after 25 BC, in contrast to their notable absence in occupation layers prior to this, conforming to a trend noted elsewhere at the site. We can see here the context of one of these small bronze coins as it was being unearthed. And again, another example here. It appears that the coins were lost in daily use rather than being intentionally placed, and if we are to assume that small quotidian objects have a greater likelihood of being lost the more frequently they change hands in daily use, then it appears that small change coins were being used much more frequently by the late 1st century BC than ever before. Again, it is notable that across time and space, an increased frequency of monetary commercial transactions is something commonly seen in colonial situations. The notable ethnographer and social theorist, the late David Graeber, in fact, referred to this as the, quote, military coinage slavery complex, which he argued that was present both in the Roman Empire and in early modern European colonialism. Why did workers at the port of Latara seemingly use and then lose coins far more frequently following the Roman conquest than ever before? Well, the increasing flow of commodities and consumer goods is certainly one aspect. A broader comparative look at empires across space and time also forces us to consider other more negative aspects, such as the growth of debt and wage labor among local populations, something certainly seen, for example, in places like colonial Africa. And again, what we see is not a neat, well-demarcated separation between an Iron Age and a Roman period, but rather a series of continuities in local daily life that were punctuated and ruptured by significant social transformations and relationships that structured the community. Given this, it certainly makes little sense, I would argue, as is traditionally done according to disciplinary boundaries, to separate the history of the community at Latara into an Iron Age period in the hands of a small number of anthropological archaeologists and a Roman period in the hands of classical or Roman archaeologists. Instead, it is perhaps more useful to think diachronically about how changing power structures in the wake of the Roman conquest across the region may have impacted local social relations at settlements such as Latara. In conclusion, if one were to excavate an Irish village abandoned during the Gorta Mór in Ireland in the 19th century, or a hacienda in Mexico occupied by natives speaking both Spanish and an indigenous language in the 18th century, it would be odd and perhaps even somewhat offensive to speak of this as British or Spanish archaeology, even though chronologically the sites were occupied during a time period in which the countries were under British and Spanish rule. I suggest the same is true for a place like Latara, Alanoa of Agonetis, as well as the anonymous Latarenses working and possibly living in the buildings unearthed by recent excavations, were almost certainly not Roman citizens, nor did they necessarily think of themselves as Roman in any meaningful way in their daily lives, but arguably they were colonial subjects whose lives, compared with that of their ancestors, have been irrevocably altered by the violence of empire. What we're doing, I would suggest, is not so much Roman archaeology, but rather the archaeology of a colonial society that can be fruitfully compared and contrasted with a material culture from other instances of colonialism. Hopefully then, this talk has provided one perspective on what a decolonized archaeology of the Roman Empire might look like at a specific site that is helpful to think about as we contemplate the future of the archaeology of the ancient Mediterranean world in the 21st century. Thank you.
Yeah, so now we have some time for questions from the audience for both of our speakers. I can pass around the mic. I would ask that you speak into the mic so we pick up the recording of the questions. Does anyone have a question to start us off?
Thank you very much. Thank you for both talks. They were really good and really interesting, and I think a great start to the morning. Ava, I had a particular point to make on yours. Thing to say. And that is you were talking quite rightly about, holding conferences as opposed to actually doing real stuff to address the issues around diversity and decolonization and so forth that you were talking about. And I wondered if I could just mention one thing that I initiated at Liverpool and that's really taken off and has been so far very successful. It also relates to the point you made about journal publication and publications. It's very clear, and I know this is having been on the World Archaeology Board, but also editing JHS, that journal publishers are at this point really, really interested in diversity and very keen to get more people from more different academic backgrounds, different countries, different scholarly traditions involved in publication. And in practical terms, it's actually really quite hard to do. And it doesn't help, as you pointed out, that English is this kind of not just dominant, but domineering language in the sort of high-impact journals. What we did at Liverpool is we started in the pandemic year, actually, a program of visiting scholars from countries around heritage very generally, including archaeology, but going beyond that. And it was aimed to support scholars working in the broad field of heritage from any sector, whether that's research councils or government or heritage bodies or museums or universities, and particularly aimed at countries where they'd suffered conflict or where resources were very limited. So we've so far, and this, because of the pandemic, had to be done digitally. And it's turned out to be a good way to do it because in the present unpleasant government that we have in the UK, it can be very difficult to get visas for people to come over. So we've continued it digitally. Basically what we do is we support scholars from these countries to work on bringing to fruition for publication an article aimed at specifically a high-impact journal, international journal that's English language, because this can be really transformative for these people and their teams. And we give them honorary roles, we give them mentors, we offer training, often quite practical training in techniques like photogrammetry and GIS and a range of other things online. We make all our library resources available to them, and we mentor them and support them and help them with English language and with writing and with how you write for high impact journals in English. And it's really worked. And we give them research expenses.
That is so cool. So I have so many things to say, but first of all, there are when I was mentioning this, I didn't say that there was nothing done, of course. When you mentioned this, I think again, like, lots of these things are hidden. I'm also part of the problem. I'm in an editorial board of Archaeological Dialogues. We have a similar issue. It's so difficult, especially what I said about theory. That's such a Western way of how we define that. We have to, on the basis of the fact that that some people do not write in that language, we have to dismiss their papers. That's an awful thing. So there's so many issues there that cannot be solved apart from radically changing how we run our journal. And we try to do similar things, but I don't have a solution at the moment. I think we have a very bad thing going on with our theory. So I really like what you're doing. I feel that so many things are hidden and localized. There are lots of things that have been done. And I wish there was some kind of, I don't know, online platform where we can share these things so that we have access to labor that you've done. And when I said reinventing the wheel, that's what we've been doing every time. So either you do the labor and it gets unnoticed and it works, or everyone does the same labor. So I wish there was a way that we could form something that we can share these things without having to do that every time, sharing the struggles as well as the things that work.
I'm sure there is, and let's talk about it offline of this, but I'm sure we could do that.
Action.
Sorry, I actually didn't have this question until you just said this thing, but is it actually so bad if we're all always doing this? Isn't that actually like the idea that we should be able to centralize this and sort of have there be like a special place where we do all of the outreach stuff, but it's not something that we have to confront in our own research every day? Like if we're talking about giving the time and space to it, isn't there an argument to be made that says like, no, actually, this is something that each of us should, in fact, and I don't mean, like, that sounds like a super argumentative question, and I don't mean it exactly that way, but just in listening to this exchange, like, there strikes me, and I say this coming out of the space of the Caucasus, which is like a very different environment for working, but it strikes me that if this is a disciplinary priority, then like part of the disciplinary priority needs to be each of us saying, yeah, in fact, right? Like that's a major part of my research agenda, actually, promoting this type of thing. And that then is obviously, that feeds into a conversation about institutional priorities, right? And needing to make sure, because what happens right now is that this becomes priority number 17 after a very long list of other institutional priorities. And so then we say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just all network and have, centralized things so that I can then go and do priorities 1 through 5, which count towards tenure and promotion in more significant ways, which have to do with my core academic research output, rather than, but like that seems like actually maybe something to make a case for, to say like, no, actually, like.
You make it incredible. I completely agree with you. I don't necessarily think that a platform will lead to people not doing labor. I think it is the other way around. You have those priorities, and there could be something that's helpful because other people went through it.
Yeah, like I certainly don't want to make an argument for reinventing the wheel. I just mean, I think often when we talk about this, and this is also coming out of the space of the South Caucasus where we have these discussions inside of our, that it often is about sharing labor in order to be able to do other things. Whereas maybe the conversation needs to be making space to do this thing as a central thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't want to talk because I'm, as a non-UK person in a UK working environment, I'm confronted with something that's called a ref cycle, and I really do not want to talk about this, but it's how funding works. But the nice thing that happens there, so that's based for all UK universities, and they added something that's based on social engagement. So then it becomes institutionalized as a priority, and now everyone, and you can hate it, but it works. So what I wanted to say with politics of disorientation is that it should be broader and integrated. And that's not a platform, obviously, that's something that goes much deeper.
Thank you very much for 2 very interesting papers. I just have one comment first on Benjamin's paper. I quite agree with many of the points you made, and one of the things that I'd sort of suggest is that you actually take this problem of, if you will, titling further, one step further. We don't even think about questioning why do we use terms like Iron and Bronze Age? They have their own problems. What are we speaking of, and why do these periods get metals as their title, and others get ethnicities? And I think that that's something, it's this way, how do we refer to these peoples? The notion of using the word tribe, for example, which has been so deeply embedded. I think what we need to think through is, even in the archaeologies and the histories outside of the Greco-Roman, we have to unpack some of the problems that we see there. And secondly, to follow up on, I noted the discussion about the bibliography is in English. You know, this is where we get into the problem of clashing agendas about accessibility, justice, and equality. That is the idea of people not reading languages and ancient languages at all. And so sometimes you can see these journals, see people responding and saying, we want these things to be accessible to people, and if they're in another language, and the absence of being able to read these ancient Greek modern languages has made these accessible. And it's a problem of sometimes pushes in different directions in an attempt to respond to a problem that is short-sighted in its own way. And I think some thought needs to be given as to why that decision was made in the first place.
I'll just add, I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with the point about chronological periods. And I found this sort of trap of you sort of fall into referring to Iron Age. And so then I talk about Roman period, but it's not really Roman per se. But I would just add, because I agree, and I think that's actually potentially a need in the future to think more. And I actually thinking of Lisa's talk, and something that struck me is this sort of need, I think, to be committed to an area and just sort of be involved. And that involves in all sorts of things that Lisa talked about. But I think one of those is to not think in time periods, but in the sense of sort of like, well, I do this period, but not this period. But I think of a sort of commitment to an archaeological place is also appreciating just the vastness of time and how these people are changing. And that's, for me, why I think sometimes these boundaries of sort of disciplines aren't really useful, because of course you're going to do sociological analysis, and that's a little bit more anthropological. But of course, you get farther in time, you're going to be talking about these sort of Mediterranean civilizations. And I wholeheartedly agree, and that's why I would just add, I think that maybe we need to rethink about how we sort of position ourselves in terms of this long-term practice of
Things like pre-Roman.
Absolutely,
Suddenly people don't get an identity, they're just pre this.
Exactly, they're just going to get before the important stuff. So I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. In terms of ancient languages, I completely agree that there's issues of education and accessibility. In the case that I mentioned, that I had to translate original titles, I do not think I disagree. Look, they're written in Spanish and Italian. They are about Spain and Italy and the Mediterranean. What does accessible mean? There are lots of people in this room that do not have English as their native tongue. I learned English to make you able to participate in this environment, to make things accessible to all of you English speakers. And I'm not the only one. So if you say accessible, you mean English, a particular group of people. And I think it's appalling that a journal that says that they're international asked to translate things that are written in Italian, that I need to translate book titles to English. That makes me really angry.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that it's not just.
The word accessible is not neutral.
No, it's centric. For example, if I introduce these, for example, nobody reads in undergraduate classes any of these languages in America, and it's a problem. I'm not defending it. I'm saying that it is the problem we get into is saying, how is this making it inaccessible, to me?
Yeah.
As an equity issue. I can't read it, so I can't get at it. You know what I mean?
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Ben, I had a question. Building on what Lisa talked about yesterday in her keynote, I was curious, you talked about your experience between classics and anthropology. I wonder if you could say some more about your experience between America and French, too, and what it's been like for you to develop some of these methodological and theoretical approaches as being so deeply integrated into French archaeology.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think France has a very, nationalist is the wrong word, but it's very sort of tied into to French archaeology, and it doesn't branch out. And this isn't meant to be a critique because I've learned a lot, and certainly methodologically I think they're very advanced. But it's a little bit more insular sort of focus. So I always felt sort of walking in like sort of three different worlds of anthropology, Anglophone Roman archaeology, and then French archaeology, which is very different. And in French archaeology, because of, I think, development of preventive archaeology, it does have more of a sense of sort of, I mean, quote, Iron Age people talking more with Roman, quote, Roman people, and so on. And again, this has just been sort of my experience, and I don't mean this as a critique, because I'm tremendously fortunate to be able to work with French teams. But I think sort of in the sharing, I guess I would say I've learned a tremendous amount of methodologies working with French teams. And then sort of conversely, I hope I've shared sort of, I think the sort of what they would sort of refer as the Anglo-Saxon sort of tradition has a sort of deeper theoretical, and even if that's sort of problematic, I think there's an issue of thinking beyond just the mere sort of description in France sometimes, of thinking sort of in sociological analysis or whatever we call it, sort of theoretical, that hopefully sort of offer. But that's been sort of my experience, that hopefully, and sort of what Lisa was talking about, of sort of building different connections and internationally, and getting beyond sort of familiarity of learning from these sort of different perspectives. So for me, it's a positive thing is sort of a shout out to her talk is sort of just this sort of immersion in the country. And as I said, that can be a very sort of deep commitment, as I said, to the history of it. It's not like you're just doing, if you find Roman, I sort of red slip where, it's still important. Or I'm just thinking of what you had said last time about the French team, which is very different abroad. I should say that the French team's abroad as opposed to in France. But yeah, I think of just Lisa's talk about it being a positive thing of that sort of immersion. So.
I'm minded of taking a trip with Barry Cunliffe at a certain point, children, Crete, and we go and see a British site, and it's clearly being excavated in wheeler boxes, in spits, and I don't know what. And Cunliffe said, "We export our worst." That is certainly true of the French.
Yes, yeah. It happened
It's
the
extraordinary.
Of North Africa.
North Africa, yeah.
Completely carried over in the same way. The divisions.
Yeah. Think of
But then-
these kind of people. But they also do not read any other languages that aren't French, and that is their deal.
Yeah,
Just saying.
That's a drawback. And I would actually say, I actually see some similarities with American archaeology, is that methodologically, it's preventive archaeology that has really driven a lot of the sort of methodologies. And I see that with the US, having worked some with CRM. And similarly in France, it's preventive archeology that's driving
Absolutely.
the methodologies in France. And the people that work abroad in France don't necessarily have a long tradition of sort of preventive, much less of a sort of tradition of being involved in the preventive archaeology in France as the people that are working in France do.
Let it be said that with Asterix, you get the two perspectives. Now you go to Spain, and they are Romans, and there ain't no Spanish Asterix. So at least they've got a sense of the mixing of Roman and, let's say, Gaulish.
Yeah, although I actually had, and I don't want to speak too much for it, but my sense is in Catalonia, the Iberian identity has been very sort of important for sort of local Catalan. But I don't want to speak for it, but just having worked with Catalan teams, I'd maybe be a little bit different in Catalonia. But yeah.
I'm sorry to put an end to such a great discussion, but we have to take our coffee break. And certainly you can keep talking outside, but please join me once again in thanking both of our speakers.